thank you for coming out this evening for what I'm sure is going to be a fantastic lecture. And thank you also for coming out on such a cold evening. It feels like winter's finally arrived this evening. So this is the Esmee Fairbairn lecture, which has been an established part of Lancaster's annual programme of public lectures for over 40 years. It exists because of the generous support of the Esmee Fairbairn Foundation. This foundation was established by Ian Fairbairn in 1961 in memory of his wife Esmee, who had played a prominent role in developing the Women's Royal Voluntary Service during the Second World War, as well as helping to create the Citizens Advice Bureau. She was tragically killed in an air raid during the end of the Second World War. Ian Fairbairn, who was himself a leading city figure, whose company M&G was the pioneer of the UK unit trust industry. He endowed the Esmee Fairbairn Foundation with a greater part of his own holding in order to support ways of improving financial education. Ian Fairbairn's interest in financial education stemmed from his concern that most people had no access to the stock exchange and were therefore precluded from investing their savings in equities and sharing in the benefit of the country's economic growth. It was this concern that led to the creation of M&G in 1931. We at Lancaster are very grateful to the Esmee Fairbairn Foundation for its support, since this has allowed us to benefit from the wisdom of many eminent speakers over many years, and this tonight will be no exception. So we're particularly fortunate this year to welcome Professor Stefan Dercon. Professor Dercon is one of the world's leading development economists and has been Professor of Development Economics at the University of Oxford since 2004 and Chief Economist at the Department of International Development since 2011. In 2015, he also joined the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford as Professor of Economic Policy and is Director of the highly respected Centre for the Study of African Economies. Professor Dercon's contribution is widely recognised in both the economics profession and government circles. Professor Dercon has contributed to the understanding of very diverse issues, including the importance of risk and aspirations for poverty, the foundations of growth in poor societies, the role of agriculture and rural institutions, the impact of migration, the political economy of aid and responses to natural disasters. His works on access to credit and insurance pay tribute to the original concern of Ian Fairbairn for promoting financial inclusion. The eclectic nature of his works is also reflected in the methods he's used in his research, starting from theoretical modelling to the collection and analysis of longitudinal data sets in countries such as Ethiopia, India or Tanzania, and more recently the use of randomised control trials. He's a true applied economist and not afraid to reinvent himself to tackle the most pressing issues of our times. In academic circles, his work's been acclaimed and published in journals as prestigious as the Journal of Political Economy, the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of the European Economic Association, and many others. But what may be his most remarkable achievement is his ability to combine the most advanced research with strong policy impact. Even before joining DFID as chief economist, he was already providing advice on development issues to international agencies such as the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, and many others. And at DFID, he's not hidden himself behind a politically sensitive position to express his evidence-based opinion on development-related issues. So it's with great pleasure I welcome Professor Dercon for enlightening us on some of these issues we'll see in his lecture this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for this most generous introduction. I hope I won't disappoint you. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, combining some of my interest in research and thinking about development and other things in the world, but also with my experiences as a civil service, in the civil service in the UK. So I've been now for just over 5 years, essentially a civil servant, spending at the moment only a third of my time working for DFID, for the Department for International Development. Previously, until last year, I was doing this essentially full-time for a while. I think it was an eye-opener. You know, as I alluded to earlier, I've always had an interest in policy and way policy making takes place. But sitting inside in Whitehall and actually seeing it in action definitely makes you think slightly different in terms of how policy is working and how actually as experts or thinkers or people that want to give advice to politicians and in political environments of how it actually works. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about is some of, my experiences working in that context, but also show you some research we ended up being able to do where the subjects were civil servants and indeed World Bank officials. And we were able to study some of their biases, both in political terms and in behavioral terms. And that's a little bit what I will be spending some time with. So let's hope I get this to work. No. Oh, interesting. Okay, good. So my questions are a little bit, what constrains the expert in all these organizations? And this is based on kind of original survey work we did and experiments that we managed to do, and also just a little bit my own reflections on it. So let me talk briefly first about, experts as civil servants. It's an interesting time for experts to work in Whitehall. We had an interesting time in the last 6 months where experts has become a dirty word. It was definitely, at the moment, let's say a little bit challenging to be an expert and an economist working as a civil servant because, it's become quite controversial to do this. Now, I don't know what ideas you have about the civil servants, what you think if you think of London. Well, I can imagine some of the things you think of when you hear London, but if you think of civil servants, whether that's what you have in mind. I know there's a lot of foreign students here, but hopefully you know who that is. If you haven't learned this when your time in Britain, then you haven't learned anything about Britain. So anyway, and I won't even tell you who it is. Or some of you may have seen this, this is a scene from Yes Minister. And if you want to know something about how the civil service works, look, it's not a bad introduction. It is a bit like that sitting in the inside. It's probably less a little bit like the silly steps that John Cleese is doing there on top, but definitely Yes Minister's that. It also has a bit of this. I don't know who of you remembers this one. It's still available definitely on the internet to see. This is from In the Loop. Which, let's say, was a bit of an up-to-date New Labour version of Yes Minister, but with definitely far worse language. Actually, somewhere in between the two, that's actually what Whitehall feels like, what policy making often feels like, where, you get lots of interests are happening, you get advisors, you get comms people, you get political advisors, you get a lot of tension and adrenaline, but, it's actually still where quite a lot of action is. This is the department I work for. Of course, we're far more sensible. This is a group of civil servants on a field trip in development. Of course, we're far more reasonable and modest people in that respect. By the way, if you ever want to watch something that is really interesting, not least, about US and UK relationships, this was a film version of In the Loop, still on the web, worth watching. Actually, some of the advisors were actually people from my department. They are on the credits at the end. And many of the scenes shown are actually real things that happened in indeed our US-UK relationships over the years. But anyway, this is not what I'm not going to just show you little clips. Because once behind is the kind of flippancy and the kind of images and the impression and the strange things that you learn there. It's something quite remarkable about being a civil servant in the UK, because there is something called the Civil Service Code. It's basically a codified set of rules that you have to abide to. And these are quite interesting if you look at it. This is a quote from it. You're expected to carry out your role with dedication and commitment to a set of core values, which are things like integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. Now, there are definitions for this. And if you take, for example, objectivity is basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence. Basically, when you become a civil servant, you're meant to do this. You're totally meant to follow this. You're meant to also impartial, acting solely according to the merits of the case. But this actually makes civil service life tricky and interesting at the same time. Because meanwhile, you're there to support government. You're actually a servant of the executive, in power, and you're accountable to your ministers who in turn are accountable to Parliament. And just think of that conflict between being accountable to Parliament, people that are voted in not because of their evidence, but because of their views and their opinions and the trust that people put in them. People that you have to be accountable to them, while at the same time your code says you have to be impartial and you can only use all the evidence that's available to you. Is that actually that balance, that tension, makes it really interesting. Okay? Now, I must say, you could say, well, you know, how do you overcome this? Well, very hard. It's definitely very hard. And even though we do that in the UK, in probably some of the most non-politicized civil services that we can have. Nobody's appointed because of their party political affiliation. It never comes up. Actually, for most of my colleagues, I can only guess what they are. I come from Belgium originally. It's already something that says something about the UK, that as a Belgian you can be a senior civil servant, but that's another matter. It could never happen in Belgium, I can assure you. But basically, you can only be a civil servant if you have a party affiliation. So you're actually based on your party card, otherwise you can't get into it. So you will know if your party is in power, then you'll get promoted to the front office, and then all the people in the administration that belong to that party will then serve the minister very closely, and the rest have very little to do for the next 4 years. Now that's a very different thing. Francis Fukuyama writes about this in saying, look, the quality of your government institutions can also be expressed by how many people need to leave their job once an election takes place. And where Denmark, it's about 8 people. In the UK, it's probably 20 or 30 advisors that have to change. In the US, it's something like 10,000 that will actually have to change position. So you get very different systems. But anyway, how do we do this? Now, in the first instance, we have to be political servants. Okay? And that's a kind of a striking thing. Now, I can assure you it's sometimes very challenging, because being a political servant, you get people that come and tell you, as actually, and I know it's been filmed, so I can't name the person involved, but a very senior person in the civil service basically comes to talk to a group of senior civil servants in a particular government department, and it says, you know, all this evidence, Lark, it's highly overrated. Just trust your gut. That's how we in the private sector tend to do it. Now, that's an interesting statement, you know. Unfortunately, one of our Director General stood up and said, you know, look, it's good to say that in the private sector you do it, but you at least have your profit margin and you have your stock market rating and all that set of information how you're doing. Evidence is and she meant our civil servants, is our only defense. Is that actually you need to kind of really work very hard. But still you work in that environment. You also work in a political environment where once in a while, more or less, this is what you've been told. You know, keep calm, we're just going to do it because I know I'm right. You know, and arguably, this is the environment in which the expert is actually working it. It creates a whole series of challenges if how you operate. Okay? Now, you know, this is something you have to take into account. But still, I will say, it's a very striking thing that in a policy environment, you're still encouraged to use evidence, and that's actually what the code says. Now, I will actually qualify this, even conscious that this is being filmed. You get some peculiar things that you have to live with. For example, working in international development. More or less the dream seems to be in international development always. If you start looking at the Millennium Development Goals, of all these big goals we have, we're actually trying to turn the world into Sweden. That seems to be most of the time, if you hear communications from a development organization, it feels a bit like, you know, we're dreaming of turning into the world into Sweden. You know, very equal society, full of integrity, you know, not really countries that are not really trying to conquer other countries, but very peaceful, institutionally very strong, and all fairly, seemingly very modest people. But of course, you do this in a context where, well, maybe in the UK we're trying to turn it into Britain, the world, maybe it's a little bit, but you do it in a context where the reality that you work in international development is actually the world looks a bit more like this, an absolute mess, really tricky setup and difficult things to do. So you end up already in an environment where you need to communicate and keep it simple and keep it all as if in development you're going to try to achieve very clear what you're going to do, and we're going to achieve all kinds of goals and targets, but you have to do it into a world what is really messy. And you need to actually do this as if, also as a civil servant, you're actually being told to actually just keep it simple. Make sure it's all very clear how we're going to get from A to B. And again, you know, using detailed, complicated evidence is not necessarily there. You also have to be conscious that you do this in the context of a state, and this is like if you do it in an international setting, that maybe the state we're in is a bit like this, but actually the political environment, you have to operate as an expert. It's not just that the world is quite messy, and you have to keep it simple and explain very simply how you can do this. But actually the state you're operating in rarely looks like the UK as well internationally. I mean, the states we're dealing with, you know, maybe they rarely look like Britain, but if you start thinking of the animals that you deal with, the kind of countries where you need to do international development policy making and you're trying to have an impact, yeah, some of these countries are like tiger economies, you know, slightly authoritarian maybe, but look, at least they're committed to development and they're moving forward. Some others are a bit more like peacock economies where, you know, it's all big show there, but actually there's very little meat in terms of what's going on, and the kind of environment where you then have to be an expert is very different in terms of in the way you have to handle the political economy of it. Actually, the peacock is incidentally used by quite a lot of countries as the animal, but I find it a very strange choice as the animal of choice to describe your own country. You get maybe some lions, say in Africa, there's no tigers of course in Africa, but maybe some lions, quite authoritarian states that do things. But you also get states where, think of it what it would be like to be a civil servant in, where actually probably a tiger fish is a better way of describing it. You know, it's a fish that is very prevalent in the Congo River. And its only purpose in life seems to be eating little fish. You know, quite interesting states where this is probably the more accurate one. I once had the pleasure of making a presentation, not exactly this, but I was using the animal metaphors to talk about political economies you had to work in. And this was in the DRC in front of a set of ministers from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they just laughed when I said, this sounds like a good animal to describe your country. Now think of it, what it is like to be a civil servant working in that kind of setting, or an expert that tries to give advice. You also have hyena countries where the real purpose of political leaders is to basically scavenger economies where you just destroy. This South Sudan springs to mind these days. Or indeed countries where the state doesn't really care that much, a bit like a hippo floating in a river. God knows why it is so big. What the hell does it do? But we do, of course, as a mammal. The hippo kills more people than any other mammal in Africa, but it's definitely vastly big. Yes, it does. But anyway, so you get states that feel a bit like where the state seems to be floating a bit aimlessly. So often I have to work with civil servants in some of these countries, but actually very little will come from what you can do, because their room of maneuver, it's different from what you would have in Britain. Anyway, working in a political setting, my main thing is that I wanted to give away and give you a flavor of. You know, in any setting you work in international development policy making, in any policy making setting, if you work as an expert, just be aware you work always in some form of political economy and a politics that you need to take into account. But does it mean you can't do your job? And actually, no, I think you probably can. You can try to be a loyal servant within it, but it's still very hard. And this is actually what the next bit I want to briefly talk about is how we can use evidence in policy making and how does it seem to work in practice. This is an interesting man. I don't know whether anyone recognizes this man. Anyway, he had an interesting relationship with salt and pepper. Maybe if I show you another picture, maybe you think he has something in his hand. This is Thomas Alva Edison. The man had a very strange relationship with salt and pepper. Very peculiar. Basically, job interviews was not about studying people's CVs and testing them on their knowledge. He just looked at it and said, okay, an engineer is an engineer. That's not really what I need for my firm. For my firm, the kind of people I want is slightly different. And how did he select in the end people? Well, once he was more or less satisfied they had the basic CV okay, he would take them out to lunch or to dinner. Okay, not like in an Oxford college where they test whether you can use your fork and knife or something and whether you can keep the conversation, but actually more in a way that actually he would just observe the person when the food came on the table. And if this person, the food was put in front of him or her, usually him at that time, and this person took the salt and pepper and put it on it before tasting, he would say, "Thank you, I won't hire you." Because he said, this person cannot be evidence-based. If they put salt and pepper on something without even tasting, that is against the scientific method. And so this is the way that a man thought that's how you should be using evidence and so on. Now, it's pretty hard, So working as a civil servant in a very quite non-politicized civil service in the UK, to try to actually say, how do we use evidence properly? Because one of the problems is that, us with the scientific method and as academics say, the truth is out there, we need to kind of find a way of discovering and getting it. Actually, this is not how policy making, in my experience, seems to work. The truth about policy making is actually, unfortunately, slightly differently. And I think it's an important thing because I think as academics, we often allow this to happen. People talk a lot about evidence-based policymaking. In fact, I hear it all the time when I work in Whitehall. But the way it works is actually slightly differently. This is something I'd never heard before joining as a civil servant, is the idea of the compelling case. This is a question you hear all the time. Is there a compelling case to do this? And the way it works is as follows. It's usually some politician or a party manifesto has an idea in it. And say, we're going to do this. And as a civil servant, you asked, is there a compelling case to do this? What it actually meant, can we find the evidence that supports this idea? Or put it different, more precise, can I find a research paper that tells, that I can cite, and on whose authority I can cite that this actually works? Okay? Now, of course, this is slightly different. This is not evidence-based policymaking, but this is policy-based evidence-making. Because I usually tell my ministers these days, I can find you on anything you want to do, probably a peer-reviewed paper in some journal somewhere that actually will prove that you're right, especially international things. I can say, actually in Indonesia it worked, even though I may know that it didn't work ever in 55 other countries. But what you'll see, and actually you should sometimes listen to a politician, speeches. It usually is a general statement and one example. A figure, a number, or some research paper that they will quote. Some kind of author authority that they quote. Now this is actually how it works. And basically, this is what I just earlier said, give me a policy, I'll find your research paper. So I never get that question anymore. Can you please tell me whether research supports my view? Fortunately, I don't get that question anymore. They just ask it somewhere else. Because, you'll always be able to find, especially economists, I'm afraid, are pretty good at that. You'll always find an economist or another expert that happily takes part in this thing. We went through a period on Brexit. We always would have some kind of academic happy to speak on one side or the other. Look, this is very peculiar as a researcher. Look, if we believe that there is something like the truth, we can't all be right when we always argue, no, I have evidence for one and for the other. This is definitely a wrong way of doing research. This is a bit like journalists. This is what journalists do. Journalists are very good because as a journalist, you can always write exactly like those political speeches, an article. In fact, read a journalistic piece. You basically get a general statement, and then they'll find a woman or a man to whom this applies. And then say, they bring it to life. For example, take microcredit. You will find definitely anywhere where there's a microcredit program ever done, you will find a woman or a man who says, this was amazing for me. You can similarly find a woman or a man and say, no, this is nothing but trouble because I couldn't really repay my money in the end and now I'm poorer than I was before. And I can write an article in favor or against. That's not the way we should be using the evidence. But when we do and write these papers and these examples, or when we feed it to a politician, we give the impression, if this is the cumulative distribution of the extent of success, and this is all the 100%, the last case is there, and this is the first case, and this is how successful it was. If we quote something, an example, we give the impression as if that's the median example. But I can always have picked really an example at the top. If I want to show that this is really something good, I'll go and talk to this particular person or take this particular project to look at it. Or indeed, I could look at this one, very unsuccessful. I can always find when I can tell that story. This is the dangers of using examples. I think as academics, and I see this all the time in policy making, there's always people willing to give that one piece of evidence, that one research paper that seems to prove a point, and then suddenly it becomes evidence-based. Very dangerous. So this is something there. We may well be constrained by politicians and their politics, but I think as experts and plenty of academics, we have a very dubious practice on evidence. Obviously, what you should be doing is giving a balanced view on the evidence. As social scientists, we're dreadful at that. We never do this. We don't value in social science the value of writing a survey paper. Oh no, it's something you do in your PhD in your first chapter or in the introduction of a paper. You don't do this seriously. In science, meta-analysis and proper, careful, systematic reviews and survey pieces are actually really important. Science and nature are full of it. Whereas social sciences, no, we don't do this thing. We much rather find a little sexy paper that we can plug and then say, oh, well, isn't it amazing? I find something else and that has these massive policy implications. One paper never has a policy implication. Only a body of evidence has it. But of course, we serve political views, ideologies, by actually doing it like that, because we'll always then be able to feed a piece of research to the right paper. So what's next? Definitely be, I would say, scientists and economists and experts, a bit of integrity would do well. We can't all be right, but we have to realize we work in a highly politicized environment. So what I definitely would want you to take away is how important it is to learn to do, again, rigorous evidence. If I'm sitting in the lift with my minister, sorry, not in the Prime Minister's office, I mean with my minister, my Secretary of State, I have time between entering the lift and going up to the 6th floor and she'll say, corruption. What works, she will say. And I have to be able to do it. Now, I could either say, oh, I have this brilliant piece that I did, and I find this and this. Or alternatively, I can say, I have no clue, but give me so much money and I will research it for you, which is the usual answer of the researcher. Or actually, I can say, well, on balance, I think this never really seemed to work and this seems to be sometime working. And actually, as people, as researchers, being able to communicate that is really essential. It happens very, very rarely. Anyway. But now it gets worse, and maybe a little bit fun as well. We can also operate as experts. We can maneuver maybe in the politics, and we can learn to actually being better researchers and looking at the bodies of evidence. But the one thing that I've also now learned, and actually it's based on this little study with it, even the best experts and the civil servants that are the experts and serving governments, they turn out to be pretty biased humans. So it's pretty tough to be a civil servant. I already set the core values, and this is actually based on work we also did at the World Bank. The World Bank has similar things, although I must say it's actually very striking. While a civil servant in the UK has in its contract that it really must uphold the Civil Service Code, if you go and work for the UN or for the World Bank, actually there's nothing there. There's no one that ever tells you have to be using all the evidence available to, or being impartial or whatever. Everything, whoever wrote that was clearly very careful, making sure that we didn't have something like evidence or something in it, because it's thing. But anyway, at least those who are involved in evaluation in the World Bank, they actually are told they have to be impartial and evidence-based in assessing what's going on. But what we know from psychology is that people are very biased in all kinds of ways, in the way they make their decisions. It's known amongst experts and normals, but actually we haven't really ever studied it amongst civil servants. Now, this is quite interesting. If you're legally required to be impartial and objective, and if your brain is hardwired not to do it, it gives you quite a challenge. Okay? And this is what we want to look at in this work. So what are we doing? We wanted to actually ensure that the policymakers and the civil servants involved that actually were confronted with their evidence on their biases. And the importance that actually organizations should be designed to overcome it. Okay, what do I have in mind? Actually, if you go back in history, Herbert Simon, man won a Nobel Prize in economics, but he was actually more a psychologist. This was the very early days of I.O., and I.O., International Organization, National Economics, never went further in that thing. He wrote these things in the late 1950s and said, the way to think about a firm is actually something that tries to overcome the failures of individuals and their biases in in the way they work as humans. So you should design firms not just to have carrots and sticks, incentives and structures, but actually structures that learn to actually overcome all the biases that people have in their decision making and then somehow doing it. And it's quite an interesting lens to look at it, because we don't really look that much at it anymore. And what we did was just having a lot of fun. We ran a survey, okay, that's one thing, and we managed to get a lot of World Bank officials, and definitely also a lot of civil servants in DFID, to answer us lots of questions. So we told them, look, this is a behavioural and attitude survey. So if anyone asks you later on, did they know they were being tested? Well, if we give them a survey about their attitudes and their behaviours, somehow they kind of knew that they were being involved in a survey, okay, around some of these things. And so we had a lot of them, and what we did was actually used a little trick. While we implemented the survey, we built in some randomization. So it meant that, say, this block of people got one question and this block got another question. So, and by building in the randomization, by slightly changing the way we ask the questions, by asking them to answer a slightly different question and so on, we got something about the population that we were studying in terms of the nature of the biases in their decision making that they have. To give an example, so early on, we wanted to actually test whether this could be done, and we thought, I thought up with my permanent secretary, so the head of DFID, and said, okay, let's try something out here. And so he said, it's fine, we can try to do this. And I said, why don't we test whether our staff can be bribed? It's kind of a natural thing you do with civil servants, you probably all think that we can be bribed, and so on. Or alternatively, can we see whether someone else, in other ways, whether they can be just encouraged and do things? And what we did simply, there was another survey that had to take place that people had to fill in, something come back, but it was important that we got them back in time. So we decided to randomize, and we sent 3 different reminders to people. One was simply, this survey is really important for the organization, please complete it, thank you very much. This is the deadline. The second one, and that was sent by simply the person in charge of the survey. It was actually a junior, someone reporting to me. Very few people would have known who it was. The second one came from me. It was exactly the same measure, but it came from me. So we were going to test, does it matter who sends the email for whether you get a reply? And the third one, we said, let's now test bribing. It again was my email, exactly the same text, but at the end, and if you complete this survey before this date, I will enter you into a prize draw, and I'll give you a bottle of champagne. Amongst the lucky one will get a bottle of champagne from this prize draw, but you will only be entered if you get it. Which basically, we ask them now to do something they're normally meant to be doing, but we're going to bribe them to do it. Okay? So what is the result? Thank God for us, therefore we could do it more, and we publicized this a bit in DFID. It turned out that if the junior member of staff sent a reminder, he had a significantly lower response rate than if I sent it. Hierarchy matters in the organization. But if I sent the email and promised a bottle of champagne, the response rate dropped back to the same of the junior member. Which is quite happy to see that, Any impact that I could have had with my hierarchy, I managed to undermine by making a flippant offer of a bottle of champagne. Well, anyway, and we publicized a lot, and people understood what we were going to do, so we got some buy-in in it. But it's the kind of things we're doing. And I would say, look, it's actually a lot of fun if people want to research, little research studies, to build this into whatever else is going on. It's quite a lot of fun to try to do it. So which one we tried? Well, we wanted to test whether people have confirmation bias. And this simply means is that you selectively seek, remember, and prefer information that confirms your views. Let's put it simply, we worried a little bit that a lot of people do this. Now, a civil servant is not meant to do it, that you not just pick the bits of information that helps you and ignore the bits of information that don't help you. When you're late at night in the pub, I can understand that you do this, but in your day-to-day job, it's maybe something that's a bit more tricky. The second one is actually here, is sunk cost bias. Now, what does that mean? It's something very prevalent in civil service, in public infrastructure, and very widely reported in private eye, which is basically projects that appear to be dying. You still seem to be putting money in it, even though you think you know that they are going to be dying. It's somehow you keep into your mind. I said, but I already spent so much money on it. Surely, if I put a bit more money in it, maybe it'd be successful. Actually, academics are full of it. Not so much with money, but with time. You know, I worked already so on this paper, but I'm sure if I do one more month of work on this paper, it will be brilliant. And I think, I don't know, maybe not academics here, but I know, including myself, that we do this. It's so hard to write off something. But rationally, this is the wrong thing. If it's dying, it's dying. Use the information at hand. There's no point spending that extra month or indeed that extra £1 million on that project. If it's dying, it's dying. And you shouldn't really be spending more on it. And I'll give you a moment how we tested that. And then finally, the most well-known one is that actually, depending on how you ask the question, you give a different answer. Exactly the same trade-offs, tendency to take riskier decisions for others, so certain things, and susceptibility to framing, I think so. So I typed it wrongly here. Anyway, and now we checked a little bit how you can do about it. Can organizational design, civil service help me? Let me try to quickly give an example and see whether So one of them was here, a very simple test. So this is essentially, we told people, oh, there's an epidemic going to come. And we think it's about 12,000 people are going to die. So can I actually suggest for a moment, pay attention, because I'm going to actually ask you to participate in a moment, okay? So participants, need to be kept alive. Just think, there's a disease there, and there's some treatment options, yeah? And there's evidence for each of the options we'll present to you. I'm going to ask in a moment to make a choice. Which treatment will you choose, okay? So can I first, actually, can those here on this side for the moment just think about what they will have for dinner later on, okay? Just do something else. And can I just focus for a second on this group here? From here and there. And I'm going to give you a choice here. And you can see it here. There's one frame here, and just see it here, where in the first frame, so the choices of the scientific interventions, one will be that 4,000 people will be saved. And the second choice is we have a treatment where a third chance is that people will be saved and 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Okay? These are two options. And can I ask you now, which one can I ask here now? You have to pick one of the two. Okay, please? One of the two. Can you now actually say who would actually advise to your minister to go for treatment option A? Treatment option A, who would go for this? Okay. It's about 15, 20, 30, 35, 35, 40 here. Okay. Who would go for B? Okay. I think we can agree it's far fewer go for B. Okay? That's interesting. Okay. Now let's do actually a very different one. Oh, you can all wake up now. And I hope you're not too hungry now. You can focus still because, thinking of hunger, behavioral scientists tell you, make you hungry. But that's, of course, a different matter. I should have picked another example. Here, we now have treatment options here. You remember the intervention was there. 8,000 people here will die with option A. And C. And option D is there's a third of a chance no one will die, and 2/3 a chance 12,000 people will die. Could I ask you who will pick number C here? And can I ask you who will pick number D here? Okay. Isn't science wonderful that you all behave exactly as you would predict? Okay, so try to remember, a lot of people chose A, And here a lot of people chose D. But if you now look and together, you don't have to be scientists or incredibly good statisticians to know, first of all, that the expected value of all the options is exactly the same. But moreover, that A is identical to C. If 4,000 people are saved, 8,000 people will die. And if 1/3 chance of people are saved, that means a third chance that no one will die. But when I suddenly start about dying, you're going to pick, oh yeah, let's take the risky option. And if I'm talking about saving, you're going to take the save option. Of course, Kahneman and Tversky showed this in the Science article in 1981, and we keep on showing it all the time, that actually we do these things. Framing matters. These are things with exactly the same expected value. When I did this, and I go to the National Audit Office, which are the accountants of government, and I do this, these guys are scared when they see in their room, because they are the ones that need to check whether we all spend our money according to rational spending patterns. If I go to the National Statistics Office, I did exactly the same. They're scared, except for a few ones saying, I think you didn't ask that question very well, but that's the National Statistics Office for you, but you actually get this. So what do we find is exactly what you got here. You're almost exactly like these officials. You know, if I ask in the gains frame, only 20% of the World Bank and UK civil servants took the gains frame option, the risky option. Very few people took risk here, but a lot of people took risk when I was framing it in the losses frame. This is a bit scary, and actually, why I got quite shocked by this when I first saw it in DFID. This was in the middle, we did a survey in the middle of the Ebola epidemic. This is exactly when we were doing these decision making about what shall we do? Shall we do more public health interventions, or shall we do more health, pure health, you know, what was it called, Carytown facilities to actually treat people, treatment facilities versus public health. These are the kind of choices you end up making. In fact, it's a very typical one because, you know, you make these choices all the time, and we see it happening. So we see these things happening, and we see it happening, and it doesn't matter at all how you correlate it with any of the characteristics of the people who made the decision. It doesn't. The only thing that matters, whether you were asked in the losses or the gains frame, there's nothing, whether your education or your age or your seniority matters at all for these kind of things. It matters. So basically, this is the conclusion here. But it's actually very striking. So when you first expose people and say, this is actually quite tricky. If we are going to be impartial people and using all the evidence, we have an example where they clearly can't do this. But then you go further, because then some of the other problems follow from it, often from framing. We can ask about sunk cost bias. Okay, so I'm not going to read it out, I'm going to have it up, for some of you may want to work through it. But basically, the story is as followed. There's a big environmental program. We've been going for a particular length of time. Somehow a new government gets into power, and in the middle of the area you're going to the environmental program, they're doing something that is definitely not very good for the environment in exactly that same area. So clearly what we told people, there is some new news about what's going on in that area. Okay? No doubt the rate of return to your project is likely to go down. In any case, it will be much more uncertain. And we simply asked people, should we continue putting money in this program? Now, the only difference that we told people is how much money was already spent compared to the share of the spending and how much money was spent and whatever. And so when we got this, now surely that new information should make you make a decision about the next money that you're going to spend. Whether you're going to spend 100 million or 150 million shouldn't depend on how much you spent already, but it should depend on the information you have. What's the value of the money, the rate of return to this project? But what we see here, this is what you see in the World Bank and in DFID, is that actually, it is the line here, is that actually saying if 30% is already sunk cost, the likelihood of committing further funds is about 40%. But it goes up to about 50% if more money is already spent. Now, a lot of people recognize this very quickly and said, oh, no, I need to be very careful, and it's what I do. In fact, a quarter of the sample are economists in the World Bank. A lot of the people there work on infrastructure. DFID is a bit fewer economists, but quite numerous people. And it's very striking. It shouldn't be upward sloping. It shouldn't be more. I know it's very hard to understand. Actually, someone says, surely if I spent 90% already, maybe it's okay to spend the rest. Actually, that's a lot of the intuition that people would have would do it. Incidentally, we also asked that what you think your colleagues will do. And everybody said that their colleagues were more likely to spend it. They were the clever ones. Which was for us actually, they knew what we were asking. Because they said, no, my colleagues keep on spending money. They don't care really about this new information. And then there was a significantly higher, that's the top line there, a significantly higher incidence curve depending on how much is being spent and then the likelihood of committing further funds. Does it correlate with anything? Actually, with very little. Funnily for us, the World Bank is even more likely to actually keep on spending the money than actually DFID is, although the effect appears somehow. But actually, it's funnily enough, again, the environment experts, they like spending that money, it seems, in the World Bank. God knows what that meant, but not very good. Nothing very good, I can assure you. Probably thought, oh, if I don't spend it, someone else will spend it on health. Imagine how could we get that? Anyway, and we had some other further relationships that we tested. I'm not going to say much more about it, but indeed there seems to be something there that also the further away you were from the action on the ground, the more likely you were to actually go and spend the money, continue to spend the money. Headquarters, who cares what's going on there? We'll just spend the money. Anyway, interesting. But it's really important because this is really not a way of spending money well. This is not a way of spending taxpayers' money well. But we get it all the time in projects, usually in IT in the UK, IT project, public procurement of IT projects. They keep on overrunning and we keep on spending. And actually the way you can rationalize is that actually people are gambling for success, increasingly gambling for success, which is a bit like option D that you were doing here. When you say, oh, it's going to go wrong here, someone is going to die, a project is going to die, my job is on the line, I better gamble for further success. And that's what we think is happening. Having said this, if I was a politician, sunk cost bias is something I probably like. Because I'm also buying something else. I'm buying time, not just gambling for success, I'm buying time. And maybe by then I'll be moved to another government department, so it's someone else's problem that the project is failed. And so, because if I stop the project now, the headline in DFID, the headline would be, suppose I stop the project after 350 million pounds is spent and not after 500 million pounds spent. The Daily Mail headline after 350 million will still be, DFID wastes 350 million. That's not that different qualitatively from a headline writer's point of view and from perception from the public to have a sentence, DFID wastes 500 million pounds. So actually as a politician, I will gamble for success. The authorizing environment, reputational risk, means that I will actually want to do this. Very scary. We do it all the time. Anyway, that's another one. And this is the worst one that we found. This is confirmation bias. So remember that actually you seek out the information that you like and you ignore the information that you don't like. Now this is civil servants that are meant to be impartial. And I think it's a pretty clever test. It actually comes back to someone, Kahan, a political scientist in the US, had something related on gun laws in America. But anyway, what we did is the following here. Okay? We gave people, I should also have an animation here to show it better. We gave people a matrix of data. Okay? All very numerous people here, definitely. This is as if it's a result from a program evaluation. You're in the program or you're outside the program. And this is the number of observations where things are better. This is after the program. And this is the number where nothing has changed, where it's not improved. Yeah? And this is if you don't get the program, and this is if you get the program. Okay, so I'm going to briefly ask you, but I'm not going to make you say it, because I know lots of you will make an error. Could you tell me, look at these numbers, does this program work or not? Okay, so don't have to say anything. But basically, if you see a number set of this, so many people got better off, so many are the same in the program. This is people without the program, and this is. Just think for yourself. I will not try to shame any of you. Because actually it turns out that about more than a third of civil servants and a third of World Bank officials got this wrong. Okay? It's actually even more than that, but I'll explain for you in a moment. We asked this not just as a number of this table, but also we told them a story. We asked them, did the program work? But in the one case we said, this was a program about skin cream and whether it actually helped you get rid of rash. For another part of the sample, we asked exactly the same numbers, but we said this is about a minimum wage program and whether this actually improves or not the incomes of the poor in that district. Exactly the same numbers. That's what we did further. We wanted to make sure this is not about the order of things. We kept on randomizing the labels and this, but everybody got exactly these numbers. We kept on labels where kept on being mixed. So it's not about the order of what is the program, what's not the program. You don't pick the first one, the second one, whatever. Okay, you have in mind what is the truth. Well, the truth is basically if you got this one, it actually doesn't work. Okay, because you could simply say, for example, the ratio of those who work and the same is actually smaller than the ones not in the program relative to the ones who were, the ones that improved and they were the same that were not in the program. Anyway, that's what it is. But it takes a moment, and a few of you will make an error in the quickness and because you're hungry. By the way, we know from behavioral evidence that if you're hungry, your IQ goes down as well. So anyway, but this is what we find. So look first at this. This is when we do it what we call the neutral frame, the skin cream. We actually got about 65% of people getting it right. That's a third don't get it right. No. Okay, but that's a neutral frame. If we asked in the same numbers when it's framed in terms of the minimum wage, this goes down to below 50%, 45%. Simply by asking the question differently, it goes down dramatically. It gets worse. It gets worse in a bad sort of way for civil servants. Somewhere else in the survey, totally different part, we asked them, on a ranking from 1 to 10, do you think inequality is good or bad? And the worse it is, you give them a lower score. If you think inequality is bad, you give them a 1. If you think it's actually a good thing for society, some inequality, you give them a higher score. Same, we ask for your political affiliations. If you're leftist, you are more closer to 1. If you're to the right, you get more closely to a 10. Now we correlate making errors in this little exercise. And what we find, not going to explain it in great detail, we find first of all, we did a little numeracy test as well. If you enumerate, you're better at these numbers. Yeah, well, surprise, surprise. But it explains some of the errors. But even despite controlling for this, we find that basically there's a strong relationship between making errors and the way your ideological bias goes. So you actually find, okay, let's make sure that I get it right. If the truth was that actually minimum wages is good for the poor, but you were right wing, you were more likely to make an error. And similarly, if the truth was minimum wages are bad for the poor, and you were a lefty person, you were more likely to make an error. And this is totally different in a survey. It's very strongly, there's a lot of stars in this thing that will come in. And this is what we get here. We'll get it actually in the ideological frame. In the neutral frame, there is no relationship with your ideology. But in the ideological frame, there's a very clear relationship in the way we would expect. Gets also a little bit worse. No, it doesn't matter. There's some small details there. But here, so we make a lot of errors, and they are in line with the unconscious political views that people hold. You know, there's no reason why they come to the fore then. It's a totally different part of the survey. In fact, people had already answered this question before we even asked them for the ideological frames. Because that was the very last question of the survey. You usually do that. You know, you don't want to get them to think about the ideological in a latent way. But it's very striking that we get it. And this is even before we have to deal with our politicians. is the civil servant's bias. So when this result started circulating, we had actually former head of the civil servant, Gus MacDonald. He heard about it and he contacted Jeremy Haywood, who is the current head of the civil servant, and saying, interesting, we better have a look at that. Yes, indeed, we better have a look at that. So finally, interest of time, I'm almost going to stop now. We did the same about risk-taking. I'm not going to explain a great deal, but we did something similar. We did standard ways of doing risk. We asked actually whether people have a different risk aversion when they play with the money of the organization compared to playing with your own money. What we actually find is that actually they're more risk averse with public money than they express to do with their own money, which is interesting. All my co-authors say, oh, that's actually quite good. They're very cautious with public money. Look, this is absolutely rubbish. We are the biggest as government. We're the biggest risk pool in the world. No, in Britain at least. We're the biggest risk pool. You know, we should take risk with our programs because we're the most diversified portfolio of investments you can ever imagine. With all our individual investments, we should take a lot more risk. And if we are more risk-averse than we would be with, civil servants don't earn that much, with our meager earnings and our cupboard in London, it actually is quite shocking in terms of actually saying like we are not. So we clearly, and again, the reputational risk is likely to be the case. People are scared to spend money and take the risks that they probably should be doing. So anyway, to conclude here a little bit, it's quite clear that even before we start with the politics and all the things I talked to in the beginning, there's all these biases in people's decision-making that actually create quite a tricky thing. And I really think now more and more, and we don't study this enough, how should you design organizations that actually use evidence well? Because it actually is to do with how can you structure them and doing things. And maybe we do things. In fact, somehow there's a bit of evidence on it. Framing, clearly lots of vermin suggest if I present it in a particular way, I can get it through my ministers. That's, of course, the Sir Humphrey of the world knows very well that how I put a question, how I frame the problem to my minister, actually will have an impact. Unfortunately, we all know that. And the ministers know that too. But actually, even in our decision-making, as the case on the story on Ebola tells you, better look at problems in lots of different ways, because the one framing may get you a very different answer than another framing. And so getting different people looking fresh at problems is clearly quite important. There's also something on the sunk cost fallacy. I think that's a real problem, because that causes a lot of waste of money. Dying projects are still being invested in. So how can you do it? Well, I actually think my best idea is actually use a bit of behavioral science. Probably the one thing of behavioral science that has external validity is actually people saying, where you change the default option. What is the story there? People have a status quo bias. They like it as it is. So they continue with the things as they are. So maybe actually you should do it something differently. You should automatically, if an objective indicator is reached, you automatically have to stop the program. And you get actively people to have to ask permission to continue the program if you reach a particular point, which is the idea of reversing the default. Of course, it's being used on us, on savings for pensions and so on. The changing of ticking the box or not ticking the box, where the default is now everybody's enrolled in a pension savings scheme and you have to actively get out. Can we do this with big infrastructure programs where the default is automatically, if some indicator changes, you have to stop it and you have to go all the way back. But as we know, politicians probably and civil servants may well like, because reputational risk is very hard to diversify. So stopping early is seen as failure. So maybe we'll want to gamble for success as well. I'm being told that big pharmaceutical companies have exactly the same problem with their research budgets and how they spend their R&D budgets. So finally, confirmation bias. We tend to think it's working together is better than individually. Unfortunately, behavioral science also tells us, people have tried it, that if you put a group that looks very similar together, you actually probably get even worse decisions. So if you put all grey-suited people together, as you may well do in Whitehall, then once in a while say, let's do something different. Let's do something different. And you get, basically, some random things get chosen, rather than actually what you need to do. And so people say that maybe what you need is actually very diversified, diverse groups for decision-making. People, what they do, and it's quite interesting, the army has actually a good technique, which is essentially what they call red teaming. If they do an important strategic operation, then they will appoint one officer whose task it is to argue and argue and argue and find any flaw possible to the plan. They are ordered to be against the plan and give me all the arguments against it. It's quite an interesting thing. Working in a team, as I sometimes do in quality assurance of big programs, we sometimes do this now and said, you know, you are now in charge and telling you why I'm wrong on everything I say here now. It's quite an interesting thing. It's called red teaming. Actually, it's the same as devil's advocate, of course. The church had discovered this early on. To actually, the idea of a devil's advocate is literally that. Give all the arguments the devil would give against what you're saying now. But can you do this in a highly politicized environment? I don't know. But these are different things than the things we normally focus on, whether it's on incentives, on performance-related pay, on cognition, or on motivation even. This is very different things. A quick attempt we tried, and I won't say very much about it. We tested one of these. Can we actually get the same survey as we did? And we did actually simply the following. Would the biases change if we get people to work together on the survey? So what we did is essentially have a group of about 100. These were all economists. We got them to do the survey, and they didn't know what was happening next, and then subsequently randomly paired them with other people. They all knew each other more or less, and said, and now look again, do the survey now again, but do it together. And what is happening? So the results was, we got more correct answers on this confirmation question, which is quite good. We make fewer errors if we work together. Whew, it's already something. And as a result, less risk of confirmation bias, but we don't see any evidence of reduced confirmation bias, except for fewer errors. And maybe it works like that. We have less sunk cost bias. That's very good. A very clear change in the sunk cost buying, and we have no evidence on changing in the framing stuff. So finally then, well, I had this already, policy making isn't easy. You know, being an objective and impartial and honest civil servant is a pretty tough job to do. But it's quite interesting that both politics and unconscious bias makes this really tricky. And it's really, I think, it's something that's underexplored. How you do design organizations to actually overcome this. So how you actually built in that the commitment to evidence comes better out. And I think it's a really interesting thing. If anyone has a great idea, I know from the civil service in London, they're very happy to actually be experimented on. I actually directly had a message from the permanent secretary say, yeah, if you have ideas, we should try them out. Because these things may well matter. Thank you very much indeed.